It's Thursday the 24th of November 2022 and welcome to the Water Action Platform. Following the fun and games of the last few weeks, today we have a focus on COP27. We're going to hear from two people who were right there in the thick of it in Egypt. And we have an update on the water climate discussion that was covered in the mini WAP broadcast from a couple of weeks ago. And I'm going to finish today with a story about some very inventive Dutch protesters. But before we get into the main broadcast, please let me remind you of our special Christmas appeal for the charity Operators Without Borders. Now, we've talked about them last month, and in particular the work that they're doing in the Ukraine to support some of the local water agencies. If you want to make a donation, please use the link here. We in Isle are going to match all of the donations up to a cap of £10,000 sterling. Now, as always, this juggernaut of fun is only possible due to our lovely sponsors who are listed here. You may have noticed that over the last few months we've started carving out some of the individual stories from these broadcasts and posting them on social media. Now, this approach has greatly increased our audience numbers and the level of engagement and feedback, and our plan is to do more of this over the coming months, and so we hope you like this new approach. But let's start now with today's opening story. With COP27 just behind us, today feels like the perfect time to highlight the social and political problems which happen when individuals are incentivized to act in a way that is ultimately harmful to the wider community. Now, this happens with frightening frequency, and it's a well-known phenomena referred to as the tragedy of the commons. A quick search online will reveal some great images which neatly illustrate it, such as this one from earth.org. The phrase, the tragedy of the commons, stems back to the day when there was common land in which common people would graze their cattle and sheep. As a concept, the sharing of the limited amount of pasture was brilliant, but without controls, it can often become overgrazed and therefore ruined for all. Now, I particularly like this image from Sketchplanations, as it neatly highlights the water crisis aspect of the tragedy of the commons. Basically, collapse tends to happen when individuals have open access to a resource, such as a water reservoir, unhampered by formal rules and regulations to govern its use. Not surprisingly, individuals act in accordance with their own self-interest and contrary to the common good, and this invariably causes catastrophic depletion of the primary resource, in this case, the reservoir. Now, just in case you thought this was all theory, there are numerous real-world examples which should serve as a shock to our collective system and thus ensure that we stop and rethink what we're doing. It's widely acknowledged that Easter Island, with its famous giant head sculptures in the middle of the Pacific, is a perfect example of the tragedy of the commons. When the first Polynesian settlers arrived on Easter Island 1500 years ago, the island was a palm forest. The settlers used the palm trees for pretty much everything: food, building materials, clothing, fuel. They made weapons from the wood, ropes from the fibres, ships from the logs. They systematically deforested the whole island and destroyed the habitat. Now, this led to erosion, crop failure, starvation, and ultimately the collapse of the community. This is not new news. This is old news. But as we stumble from one crisis to the next, be it overgrazing in Afghanistan or deforestation of the rainforests, we humans seem intent on racing down the path towards destruction. How can we address this? Well, many brains much bigger than mine have wrestled with this, and issues like this underpin the discussions which have happened at COP27. The one thing we can be certain of is time is running out. Now, with that admittedly rather bleak introduction, we come to the section today where we're going to hear from two Water Action Platform members who were there in Egypt at COP27. Our on-the-ground contacts were Remy Gandua, Managing Director at Metito, and Nino Manes, known as Nino, a partner at PwC. Now, we interviewed them separately, but asked them very similar questions, thereby enabling the opportunity to blend the two interviews together. It's worth noting that we interviewed them during the middle of the COP27 conference. It had not yet completed. Now, what's absolutely fascinating is their quite different take on how things went.
I am Remy Gandua. I work for Metito Utilities. Metito is a developer, investor, owner, operator, and separately a constructor of water and wastewater facilities. So these are water reuse, desalination, bulk water supply, industrial water, etc. We have a series of landmark projects, including the world's largest reverse osmosis and the world's largest water reuse facilities. Equally as well, we're very active in terms of public-private partnerships, having done the first public-private partnership in the water sector in each of 7 countries. And actually being here at COP is very dear to my heart, because our first public-private partnership project is the desalination serving Sharm el-Sheikh here. So we supply about 50% of the hotels along the strip in Sharm el-Sheikh. We supply 63 hotels to be precise, with water and waste, with desalinated water requirements. And so a lot of the participants at COP are, should we say, showering in our water.
Good day, I'm Nino Manes. I am a partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers within the South African practice. I am a water expert and I've got 23 years experience both working in the public sector as well as the private sector. I'm also the ESG lead for the public sector, so specifically focusing on climate change.
For me, I'm one of the relatively few private sector participants. So it's always interesting for me to see a different perspective, those of many of the different stakeholders that are obviously involved and affected by what's going on, and learning from them and understanding their point of view.
There was a lot of new topics that was discussed. One of the key themes that came out was loss and damage, and specifically the loss of infrastructure, lives, and the impact of the economy on developing countries. One of the key things that came out was that there is a need for support to be given to developing countries when climate events have an impact on them. And one of the recommendations was looking at a disaster management fund that is set up globally to support these countries. Another key impression for me was the role of private sector. It became very clear that government alone and public sector cannot address the enormous challenges that are being faced by Africa and by developing countries, and there is a need for private sector to support.
I hope that the dialogue translates into action at the end of the day. So it's obviously easy to say a lot of good things, and what I'd like to see is a sort of the concrete implementation. Some of the targets set in previous COPs we now know will not be met, and we are living in an environment where we're living in a world where we need to very much care about the environment and climate change, and implementing whatever is agreed here, I hope is something that is followed up by all parties concerned. So there is a water pavilion which is running throughout COP, and there is also a water day where many of the pavilions will be discussing water issues. Having said all of that, and you can easily accuse me of being biased, I would very much like there to be more focus on water, especially here in COP27 and equally as well next year in COP28, which is being held in the UAE. Both regions are extremely water scarce, and having water to be a key issue and something for people to focus on is very important. The impact of water reuse in particular, in terms of what it's doing for the environment, I think is absolutely crucial and something that I'd love to see more focus on in the COPs.
A key takeaway for me was there was a lot of emotive presentations being made by the youth, by countries where they had severe either flood events or drought, and the impact on women and children. One doesn't often realize that the people that suffer most in a disaster are women and children, and they have to bear the burden of supporting the family, but they also have to bear the burden of being harassed, and their security is at stake. And just listening to the presentations being made by some of the women and some of the youth that went through this, you hear of it, but you're actually experiencing it. It really made an impact. Another key thing that was raised was that although there are very good strategies and commitments that happens at COP, the regulatory framework and the enforcing of these actions are lacking. And I think that is something that perhaps needs to be addressed going forward as well. One of the things that was raised that was quite bad for me was one of the presenters indicated that even though fossil fuels is one of the biggest contributor to climate change and the effects on planet Earth, and it has not been directly discussed at any COP as yet. And although it has last year been touched on briefly, there has been no in-depth discussion on that.
Overall, I think there's a lot of interaction, a lot of discussion so far. I hope that continues throughout it. So in summary, I'd give it, say, a 9 out of 10.
I would probably give it a 6 out of 10. Some of the presentations, it was issues that when I joined the water sector 23 years ago was an issue. And it's quite shocking to see that we have not moved on from there. And the question is, what needs to happen for that change to happen? And what needs to happen for us to move forward from addressing basic issues that should be done on a day-to-day basis and stepping up and actually start getting services to communities and start making them aware of the impact of climate change and how government and private sector can work together to support them and to help them to get through these extreme events.
Thank you, Remy. Thank you, Nino. It's great to have your first-hand feedback. I was absolutely fascinated at that 9 out of 10 versus 6 out of 10 scoring, and that was from the middle of the conference. It begs the question, dear viewer, as to what mark would you give it now that we know how it all ended? Feel free to put your suggestion in the comments box. I was also intrigued to hear that on one of the days they actually ran out of food at the summit. Now, I imagine that there were 45,000 delegates gathering to discuss the dire state of the world, whilst at the same time getting first-hand experience of just how debilitating hunger, which much of the world's population experience on a daily basis, can be. Either that, or perhaps they went into the negotiations just a little bit hangry, which, as defined here, means being irritable due to hunger. Then again, that might have been a good thing. It feels to me, after 27 of these COP conferences, that the time for social niceties might actually be over. So let's stay with COP27 and now come to the water climate discussion. This year, the water climate discussion received 2.5 hours of good news videos from 33 water sector contributors. Our friends at Andai distilled the very best bits to fit into a 1-hour live show with 3 live presenters. One of the presenters was our very own Joe Burgess, who stayed on for the full Q&A. I asked Martin to further boil it down to an 8-minute taster. If you haven't watched the recording yet, I'd thoroughly recommend that you head to isle.andai.com/WCD for Water Climate Discussion 2022, where you can watch everything. And if, like me, you did take part on the day, I'm sure you'll appreciate this little reminder.
Welcome to the Water Climate Discussion. Peter Lefort, an expert in positive tipping points from the University of Exeter's Green Futures Network, is joining us live. We also should have Joe Burgess. Joe, how are you doing?
Good, thank you very much, Martin. Really glad to be here.
Brilliant. Today we're going to be discussing positive tipping points in the water sector. As a tipping point is when a series of small things become significant enough to cause a larger, more important change. But there's an upside. Things can also tip in a positive direction, like an LED light bulb moment. We start off with an innovator who does something new. Whatever climate initiative you're working on, implementing or considering, sharing it is one critically important step in its becoming a positive tipping point. And that's exactly why we're here today, to share good ideas.
It can feel like change is very, very slow, like nothing is happening. And then it can happen all of a sudden. So as the curve suddenly goes upwards, right? And so it's not just that moment of innovation, that trigger that leads to systemic change. It's making sure that everything that needs to be in place for that trigger to take off is already there. And that's something we can talk about in a bit more detail when we hear some of the stories from the videos.
Egypt's goals for COP27 are mitigation, adaptation, finance and collaboration. So that is exactly how we're going to structure this water climate discussion.
We've identified and delivered upon opportunities to use available space on our sites to deliver more solar power.
We've now got our largest water treatment works able to run on a solar farm.
It's momentum that's carrying solar forward rather than trying to push against resistance.
We're also reducing energy consumption through deployment of new technology, delivering a portfolio of more efficient blowers, pumps, variable speed drives, heating and lighting controls across our asset base. We're also expanding the use of real-time control at wastewater treatment works and exploring the use of new software to optimise water distribution networks and improve leakage.
On a hydrogen and oxygen demonstrator project, and basically what that involves is having an electrolyzer that splits water into hydrogen and oxygen. Then all being well, we can use the oxygen in our wastewater treatment process.
We're on target to achieve net zero carbon in 2025. From that point, we'll surrender our excess carbon credits to go beyond zero carbon and start addressing our legacy emissions. This will be achieved with our 2 food waste to energy facilities. We also have many solar projects, and we started our leap into green hydrogen, which we are currently trialling.
Yorkshire Water is a success story of a new technology being implemented in a water utility in the UK. They needed to lower the volume of sludge that they had to transport by road after treatment at a sewage treatment works.
All of our big water recycling centres now, the waste heat is now useful heat for heating greenhouses. Those greenhouses produce 10% of the UK's tomatoes, so they're quite big greenhouses. In terms of mitigation, there are also some really big challenges still out there for us as an industry, particularly in terms of process emissions.
But I'm pleased to say that in the last year we've successfully piloted methane recovery technology downstream of a digester that we're now looking to deploy at scale on a number of sites. We're also testing an innovative artificial intelligence system to control our wastewater treatment works in a way that will reduce the risk of nitrous oxide generation.
We have added a vacuum system to the storage tank. This solution provides a 5% increase in our biogas production and thus reduce emissions of methane. The increase in biogas is partly achieved by pumping the ventilation air into the biogas system. The other part of the increase is achieved using the vacuum system. The lower pressure releases more methane from the sludge, just like popping a bottle of champagne.
We're seeing more and more installations of monitoring for process emissions at facility level. Data modelling approaches, hybrid modelling, process modelling, these aren't yet available for us to pick up and use, and we need to be careful when we are, for example, thinking about things like process modelling of nitrous oxide and considering incorporating this into digital twins, a really emerging, exciting area. Lots of discussion going on, and it's really important that we come together to discuss the evidence base.
We're also putting a lot of focus into reducing emissions from our investment programme.
We engaged with a whole host of different stakeholders, and we were able to really delve into this area of culture and behaviours. I guess the overall message came through was, let's just make some progress on this. With progress, not perfection.
To reduce these emissions, in the past year we have tried innovative low-carbon solutions for our site setups, compounds and welfare facilities, including the trial of HVO fuels, the use of solar-powered power pods for site welfare facilities.
Digging up the road uses a huge amount of carbon and has a really large carbon footprint.
Excavating a small excavation using long-handled tools, using suction excavators, we can improve the timeline of the job, but also getting the job done safer, quicker, and with a reduced carbon footprint.
We are driving the increase of recycled and low carbon materials in construction, for example, by using crushed glass sand as embedment material for sewers.
In this case, we did a life cycle assessment comparing a tank made of steel versus concrete. It is the great opportunities to recycle the steel that particularly favored the steel solution.
So this is not a handout, it's a financially sustainable business model.
A result of the electrification of our fleet, company vehicles are now no longer our largest emitter.
Having some sort of setup with maybe a tripod or something on the head and being able to show a live feed straight to that person on Teams at home.
It's brilliant to be able to bring in experts as well, I think, from anywhere across the world.
Of course, we know that we've got some emissions that will be difficult to reduce, and are exploring carbon capture. We've planted our first 100 hectares of new woodland.
We need to think about what is the change that we're trying to create. It's not just simply bring in an innovation and hope that it is successful or that it takes off or achieves the purpose it's trying to create. We're talking about systemic change. That's what we're trying to achieve.
I installed 2 additional water butts, so I now have the ability for 600 litres of rainwater.
And we've worked at a very human level, with those customers identified as our highest consumers of water.
Mandatory water efficiency labelling in the UK.
And nowadays you can't buy a house that doesn't have a very high standard in terms of cavity wall insulation. So why can't we do the same in terms of water efficiency?
In terms of positive tipping points, it is difficult to be definitive, but we are seeing a lot of potential from a governance perspective.
Systems that will give us much more flexibility to deal with really the changes in climate that we anticipate, and it'll enable us to supply water in lots of different ways.
We've seen a proliferation of private sector organizations developing knowledge and technological innovations and tools. For example, the concept of follow the water through recent technological advances in real-time monitoring of flows using Earth observation tools.
Trees can provide so many benefits.
But also thinking about how you can combine a reservoir with flood defence and think about storing water, but also using that storage to mitigate flood risk. But also what else that can do in terms of opportunities to sequester carbon, particularly in peat, and opportunities to restore nature.
Developing a water management strategy or plan can be an opportunity to include nature-based solutions.
Flood early warning systems.
So on the subject of finance, twice already now I've mentioned the trial reservoir.
First, we have in place a community of practice which provides a place for technical knowledge exchange among experts and utilities.
All the things that we can do to influence the political environment that are important.
I've never seen as much collaboration as I've seen right now in the water industry.
That's us. We're going to wrap up. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'll see you again.
I mean, wasn't that incredible? It was sort of relentless, wasn't it? This tidal wave of engagement and stories which are uplifting and promising. And with so many people doing so much good work, I'm sure we're going to hit a few good positive tipping points across the water sector. Now, a team of volunteer editors have produced a 40-page summary of the discussion, and you can read the report, watch the show, and much more on the webpage. What we really need you to do, however, is to take the survey that's going to shape the water climate discussion that will happen at COP28 next year. We're also setting up a number of specialist roundtable discussions which will drill into some of the tougher areas of the water climate action. Now, you can express your interest in the survey at this web link, which I will also circulate when I send around the link after these broadcasts. Next, we come to a little story that one of our members, Henrik Hagelman from Pure Affinity, sent us. Now, Henrik contacted me to ask if we could highlight the flooding and landslides that have happened in southern Philippines. Now, last month, Storm Nalgae killed at least 45 people and possibly many more, yet it caught very little media attention. Now, is that because we've become numb to this sort of news, or is it because these events are now so common that they're just not newsworthy? It's probably a bit of both. Monsoons in the Philippines are obviously not uncommon. There are about 20 of them each year. The difference, however, is that the places that are being affected are in new areas, and they're bigger areas. They're places that have not seen these sorts of events previously. As always, these events strike the water and sanitation services and infrastructure particularly hard. People have been drinking dirty water and inevitably getting diarrhea. There is, however, a bit of good news. There are people on the ground, such as Jessica Chang, the chief executive of Shop Suki, who are working hard to provide food and groceries to the affected people. Now, if you have the skills and the motivation which could help them with their water and sanitation issues, Jenica would love to hear from you, so please email her directly. And finally, with COP27 just behind us, today is the perfect time to talk about that hardy tribe known as climate protesters. They deliberately create inconvenience in order to raise awareness of the climate crisis, and their actions tend to attract one of two responses: either grudging respect or a burning hatred. Well, I might be wrong, but I suspect that the following story will create a third possible emotion in you: amusement, maybe even delight. For more on this, we go to the Netherlands, and in particular to this protest at Schiphol Airport. Now, protesters decided to inconvenience the owners of private jets by ensuring that they were grounded by doing nothing more sinister than having a cycle round the tarmac. Such simple action, yet thoroughly effective. Now, without wanting to overgeneralise a whole nation, this feels like a particularly Dutch act of defiance. Had this been done in the UK, we would have been throwing our arms up in horror at the fact that none of them were wearing a helmet or had lights on their bikes. Anyone who's walked the streets of Amsterdam will know that the Dutch do not encumber themselves with such niceties. Of course, here on the Water Action Platform, we do not endorse illegal activity. But from a purely personal perspective, I can't help but feel admiration for the climate protesters, and these ones in particular. They care so much about the climate crisis that they are prepared to put themselves in harm's way, risk getting arrested, perhaps even losing their jobs. I suspect that history will judge them better than we do today. And sure, I would have been frustrated if I was directly inconvenienced, perhaps missing a train or being late for an important meeting because a climate protester had got in my way. But let's be honest, the level of inconvenience that creates pales into insignificance when compared with the inconvenience that we're all going to experience if we all, governments, corporations and individuals, don't start taking the climate crisis seriously. With that, we come to the end of this week's broadcast. Once again, I thank all of our contributors, sponsors and partners. A year ago, we launched the Trial Reservoir, an initiative to encourage and accelerate the adoption of technologies which could address the climate crisis. And over the past year, this initiative has exploded into the water sector scene. There are trials happening all across the world in both municipal and industrial sectors in high, medium and low-income countries. The Trial Reservoir initiative has won awards and received recognition from such august organisations as the World Economic Forum and the GI Hub. So, with this in mind, in next month's broadcast, Joe Burgess, who heads the Trial Reservoir Initiative, will provide a Christmas special focused just on the Trial Reservoir. I can't wait. It's going to be wonderful. Now, that broadcast will be on December the 15th at the usual times. In the meantime, don't forget to take that water climate discussion survey at isle.andi.com/WCD 2022. Keep asking questions, keep sharing, and keep safe.